Wonderful. I think we should just go ahead and start. Good afternoon, good evening, everyone who is joining us. It's such a delight to have all of you join us on our monthly seminar series of the Lee Kum-Shung Center for Health and Happiness at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. My name is Vish Vishwanath. I am the director of the center, as well as Lee Kum-Kee Professor of Health Communications of Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health and the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute. As some of you know, the center has been established about 7 years ago and conducts a variety of programs to promote the scientific understanding of positive health, including happiness, and the translation of that science to influence public health practice and policy. So today's seminar meets that criterion very well today. Given the popularity of the speaker today and the topic, I don't want to take up a lot of time, but I do want to acknowledge the generosity of the Lee family, Lee Kum-Kee family, that has generously endowed our center and which has made the seminar series, in addition to other activities of the center, possible. So I'm grateful to them for their generous support. I also want to thank our team at the Lee Kum-Shung Center, who have worked so hard, as always, behind the scenes in organizing this seminar, including our tech support and publicity and other things. Now, it gives me tremendous pleasure to invite and introduce Dr. Robert Waldinger. By this time, some of you should be familiar with him because he has been a participant in some of the center's activities. He is world-renowned for his scientific work. He's a professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. He's the director of the Harvard Study of Adult Development at Mass General Hospital and co-founder of the Lifespan Research Foundation. He has received his BA from Harvard College and his MD from Harvard Medical School. He's a practicing psychiatrist and psychoanalyst, and he directs the psychotherapy teaching program for Harvard. But not everyone knows, but he's also a Zen master and teaches meditation in New England and around the world. And today, I'm sure some of you have seen his talks, TED Talks, and others, which are very popular. Excuse me. And today, he's going to talk about his book, Good Life, that he has co-authored with Dr. Marc Schulz. Bob, we are so delighted. I can say a lot more, but I am not the person they are here to hear and listen. So they're all waiting for you. So please go ahead, and thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you, Vish. It's an honor to be here, and I always love doing things with the center. So it's always a pleasure. Well, let me get started. Let me share my screen and make sure I'm sharing it in a way that, let's see. Okay. I'm still, yeah, I think this should do it. Okay. Now, okay, I'm getting a thumbs up from Vish, which means I'm good to go. So let me start by talking about this enormous question of what makes a good life, that the study of what makes a good life really had not been as serious an empirical endeavor until probably the last 30 years. And it came out of a big question, which is, why is it that we have forever been equating happiness with economic well-being, with gross domestic product? So we thought, particularly in the West, that if GDP was increasing, well, we were getting happier. That must be the case. And then when people began to look at it, they began to understand that no, in fact, in many Western countries, including the United States, as we became wealthier, our levels of happiness went down. So the study of happiness, the empirical investigation of happiness, is now in full swing. And the United Nations develops and publishes a happiness report every year. It's the UN Happiness Report. You can download it from the web, the 2022 report. And every year they get good scientists, demographers, sociologists, biologists to survey people all over the world about their lives. And when they do this, they find that, in fact, people are pretty consistent in what they say they need in order to feel that they are having a good life. And that, yes, it is true that our economic well-being is essential. And so, in fact, Danny Kahneman and his group did a study in which they found that in the United States, about $75,000 a year average household income was about the level at which your happiness peaked, that your happiness would go up as you made more money approaching that number because our basic economic needs were being met. Need for shelter, clothing, healthcare, educating our children, all of that. But then what the study found was that as people made more money, their happiness levels didn't really go up very much. That the difference between $75,000 a year and $75 million a year was not so great. So then what is it that people tell us around the world at all economic levels and all cultures? What do they need to feel like they're having a good life? Well, things that won't surprise you: social support, the expectancy of a healthy life, so access to healthcare for themselves and their families, the freedom to make life choices. And as we know, that freedom varies tremendously around the world. One of the interesting results across the world is that people feel they need opportunities to be generous in order to feel like they're having a good life. And that doesn't mean just generous in terms of their financial resources. It means their time, their expertise, their energy. And then finally, people feel that they need to be able to trust both their neighbors and their governments. So all of this is remarkably consistent year after year, all age groups, all ethnicities. But when they did a really broad survey of millennials, 20-somethings, about 5 years ago, they found that this was not what millennials thought they were going to want in order to have a good life. That when they surveyed them and asked these 20-somethings, what are you going to prioritize in your adult life? Over 80% said they wanted to get rich. And another 50% said they needed to become famous to feel like they were having a good life. 50% also said that they needed to achieve a great deal in their work lives. So then the question is, if none of those things, if wealth and fame and high achievement are not part of that list in the US Happiness Report, what's responsible for the disconnect? And I think much research is beginning to point to the digital revolution, and not just the digital revolution, because this was happening before, but it's been accelerated. This idea that the good life now gets defined for us instead of by us. And if we think about all the messages we get all day long about what will make us happy, it's about buying things. It's, if I buy this car, I'll be a happier person. If I serve this pasta to my family, we'll have blissful family dinners. So many messages about what ought to make us happy. And social media accelerates this. So I pulled this off of Facebook. It's one of those many photos we post of this is of a carnival, but there are photos of, us on beautiful beaches or about to dig into a beautiful plate of food. And of course, we all know this isn't the totality of life, but many of us, when we look at these curated lives that we post for each other on social media, we get this feeling that we're missing out, that everybody else is having a good life except me. Everybody else has life figured out but me. One of my teachers put it this way, and I love this. He said, we're always comparing our insides to other people's outsides. So I'm always comparing, the me that sometimes wakes up happy and confident and sometimes feels sad and like I'm losing my way. I'm comparing that with these beautiful lives that I see online. And we know that younger people are particularly vulnerable to these comparisons. Younger people in particular are vulnerable to all the images we get of what our bodies are supposed to look like. So this is a typical underwear ad. And as you can see, I chose a male body because women's bodies are much more often exploited than men's. But we are given these messages overtly and subliminally of what we're supposed to look like as human beings. I mean, when was the last time the ad industry showed us an ad like this? That what is real life like for most people? It is not what we receive from the advertising world, from the world of media. Okay, so now, how do we find out about real life? Well, I'm going to make a case for this work that I've been doing for much of my adult life. The Harvard Study of Adult Development, which is a longitudinal study of adult life that follows people throughout their lives. Most of the research that's done on well-being is done by asking people to remember the past. And that's a perfectly good way to collect some data. But as we know, memory is filled with problems. So there are, actually Dan Schachter wrote a book called The 7 Sins of Memory, in which he lays out some of the habitual errors that we make based on how we remember things. So I'll give you just 3 of them. One is the recency effect, that we tend to remember and prioritize things that happened more recently, regardless of their actual importance in our lives. Similarly, we prioritize things that were emotionally powerful. So, if I had a great vacation, but on the last night of vacation, I had a bad argument with my child, I'm more likely to remember the argument as the whole tone of that vacation. And suggestibility. One of the things we know is that when we are told what happened, we can actually reconstruct visual memories of things that didn't actually happen to us. All of this means that self-report retrospection is to be taken seriously, but with many grains of salt. The other thing that most studies do when they want to study a lifespan is to take snapshots. So, for example, if we wanted to track depression over the lifespan, we could look at a group of 10-year-olds and a group of 20-year-olds and a group of 40-year-olds and 60-year-olds right now at one point in time. But the difficulty with the snapshot approach is that we can tend to make false inferences about how life proceeds from these snapshots. The best way to explain this is a joke that a congressman, actually senator, told. Senator Claude Pepper, he was from the state of Florida, and he once quipped, "When I look at South Florida, I would have to believe that you are born Cuban and you die Jewish." That he was looking at all these young people who were Cuban and all these older retirees who were Jewish, and he understood what he was saying, but the tendency is to draw connections where they don't exist across the lifespan. So all of this is to make the case for why I direct the Harvard study of adult development, which is a study that has followed people for 85 years. Why would you invest the millions of dollars in taxpayer funds? Why would you invest all the person power and hours in this kind of work if it were not a powerful technique? And it is quite powerful. It is the longest study of adult life, as far as we know, that's ever been done. It was started as two studies that actually didn't know about each other. One was started at Harvard University Student Health Service. It was a study of adolescents moving into young adulthood. And so they took a group of fine, upstanding Harvard undergraduates, 19-year-old men who were thought by their deans to be fine specimens. And of course, if you want to study normal development, you study all white males from Harvard. I mean, we understand now how completely fallacious this, how idiosyncratic this sample is. But at that time, that's what they started with. And in addition, on another side of the Harvard campus at Harvard Law School was a study of juvenile delinquency. And this was a study that gathered a group of boys from not just Boston's poorest families in 1938, but the most troubled families, known on average to 5 social service agencies for domestic violence, parental, mental, and physical illness, a host of problems. And the question that these law professors had was, how is it that some children born in such disadvantage manage to stay out of trouble and stay on good developmental paths? So both of these were studies of human thriving, but one very privileged group, one very underprivileged group. Now we brought in the spouses of our original men, 724 men, and then their spouses, and then all of their children, most of whom are baby boomers, more than half of whom are women. So now we have quite a bit of gender balance, but to date, no people of color, because we're studying the same families decade after decade. And the city of Boston was 97.4% white in 1938. So if you want to start a study of families in 1938, that's what you got. So we now collaborate with studies of many more diverse groups, and we make sure that we only present findings that are common across ethnic and racial lines, not just idiosyncratic to a group of white people who were in Boston in 1938. So when people came into the study, we did physical exams, psychological exams. We went to their homes and interviewed their parents. And then everyone grew up and went into all walks of life. John F. Kennedy was part of the study. Ben Bradley, the longtime editor of the Washington Post, and many factory workers and bricklayers and doctors and lawyers. And we followed them all the way into old age. So what did we study? Well, we studied the big domains of life, mental and physical health, the World War II experiences of the Harvard undergraduates who were of an age to do that. The inner city men were younger, and so were not eligible to go to war. We studied work life and work satisfaction. We studied relationships, which I'm going to talk a lot about today. And as they got older, we studied aging and retirement. And then the question is, well, how did we study them? We started out with questionnaires and exams, but then we ended up audio taping, videotaping, drawing blood for DNA and for messenger RNA, things that weren't even conceived of in 1938. We put people into the scanner and watched their brains light up as we showed them different kinds of images. We brought them into our lab and deliberately stressed them out and then saw how quickly they recover from stress. All of this as a way of finding new windows on well-being. So then what did we learn? Well, The finding that we did not, well, first, the finding we did expect was that taking care of your health matters tremendously. But the finding we didn't expect was that the people who stayed healthiest and lived the longest were people who had the strongest connections to other people. The people who had broader social networks, who literally saw more people in a given day and week, stayed healthier and lived longer. And not just that, but that the warmth of these connections mattered a lot for health and well-being. And what didn't surprise us was that good relationships would keep us happier. That makes sense, right? But what surprised us was that good relationships would make it less likely that you would get coronary artery disease or type 2 diabetes or develop arthritis. Like, how could that possibly be the case? And many other studies have found the same associations. We now take this as quite a robust connection between relationship functioning and physical health. So what is it that, how do we understand social connectedness and health? Well, we know that the effects are powerful, that loneliness is as powerful a predictor of poor health as smoking half a pack of cigarettes a day, that high blood pressure is no worse for you than severe loneliness, that it is just as bad to be lonely as it is to be obese. And this is not to say you should all go out and start smoking and don't worry about your blood pressure and don't worry about your weight. No, taking care of these things matters a great deal, but the power of the effects of social isolation and loneliness is what's important here, and important not for us not to neglect. The other thing we know is that intimacy keeps us alive, that partnered men and women actually live many years longer than their single counterparts. And that's an important factor to be aware of. And yet many single people live perfectly long and healthy lives. The other thing we've learned is that cognition is very much dependent on our social activity, that people with broader social networks and people who are more socially active get cognitive decline later in their lives, and the rates of decline are slower than people who are more isolated. So then the question is, how does this happen? So how does loneliness change our physiology? Well, one of the things we see is that loneliness is associated with hypertension. It's associated with impaired sleep. Actually, loneliness, turns out, is associated with getting poorer care from their healthcare providers. That what we've learned is that lonely people give off signals that essentially prompt people to want to stay away from them. So we're learning a great deal about how to work with that. How does this work? How do relationships actually get into our bodies and affect our health? Well, there have been good studies now that show heightened cardiovascular reactivity among lonely people, probably due to stress, because loneliness is a chronic stressor, decreased immune functioning among more isolated and lonely people, and chronic inflammation that breaks down body systems over time. Now, one of the interesting things is to look at how relationships go over time. And one of the things we did was we asked the same questions about marriage 8 different times over 50 years. And we found, as did other studies, that we are happiest in our relationships when we first get together with our partners. And then marital satisfaction drops when the first child arrives. And it increases again when the last child leaves home. And then when we study couples further, we find that marital satisfaction only goes down again when people, if children return home to live. Now, again, this is in Western US mainstream culture. There are many cultures where children live at home, and that's the norm much longer. The other thing we know is that relationships do not have to be entirely smooth, that it's not about the absence of disagreements or arguments, that it's really about a bedrock of affection and respect in relationships, that seems to convey this health benefit, that it's okay to argue as long as there is this foundation of respect and affection. One of the things that changes as we get older is how we value and process information. So we get happier as a species as we get older. It seems to have much to do with our growing sense that time is limited, that life is short, that mortality is real. And because of this, taking care of our emotional well-being becomes a priority from about middle age onward. We get more worried about that. We pay more attention to positive information than negative information. We start revising our memories in a more positive direction. We get choosier about how we spend our time. So you can see people's social networks actually get trimmed a little bit when they get to this stage, because they stop spending time on activities that they just haven't enjoyed in a while, but they feel obligated to attend. And we find that as we get older, we savor the present moment. I'll tell you a little bit about how this works cognitively, because it's made for some interesting experimental work. So what we think is important about the information we receive shifts as we get older. This experiment was done in another laboratory where they brought people in of all ages, and they said to them, this is a photograph that's going to be used in an advertisement for a new camera. And we want you to tell us, which of these taglines do you think will sell more cameras? Is it capture the unexplored world, or is it capture those special moments? Well, as you can expect, the younger people thought that capture the unexplored world would sell more cameras. And the older people thought capture those special moments would sell more cameras. Then the researchers brought in another group of older people and said to them, imagine you're going to live 20 years longer than you expect to, and you're going to be in really good health during those years. And then they asked them, which of these lines do you think will sell more cameras? Those older people thought that capture the unexplored world would be much more appealing as a camera advertisement. So what this reflects is the idea that we value certain types of information differently depending on where we are in our lives. The other thing we know is that our brains respond neurologically differently to different kinds of information. So this is a group of octogenarians who we put into the MRI scanner. We showed them negatively valenced information, and you can see on the left a brain where the connections among brain regions responsible for affective processing, less connection when they're looking at negative images. But on the right, the connections are stronger when they're looking at positive images. So this is just a way of saying that our wiring is different as we get older, and it determines how we process positive and negative information. So now I'm going to tell you about something that has health implications and implications for those of us in healthcare and in public health. That what we know is that as younger adults, we are biased toward negative information. What that means is we take it in more readily than positive information, and we remember it better. And that balance shifts. The bias toward negativity shifts toward a positivity bias as we get older, where we remember what's positive, we forget what's negative. So this is an experiment that was done giving people of different ages brochures for 3 hypothetical health plans, and they had to choose one, right? And so each health plan had strengths and weaknesses. And you can see here, plan A had good access to physicians, great nursing, not such good emergency care, and not good prescription benefits. Pluses and minuses to these different plans. And then they took away they had people study them. They took away the brochures, and 30 minutes later, they asked people to remember everything they could about each of the health plans they were going to have to choose from. And what they found was that the younger adults remembered what was wrong with each health plan, but they would forget the positive features of each health plan. And just the reverse happened with the older adults. They were great at remembering what was positive, but they were bad at remembering what was wrong. And we think this may be why older adults who are perfectly cognitively intact may be more subject to scams because they pay less attention to the downsides of things. And so this has implications for what goes on during medical visits. You know, here the doctor is saying, I've got some good news and some bad news, and the patient is hearing, hooray, good news. So we modify our interview protocols to accommodate this bias toward the positive and forgetting the negative during healthcare encounters. Another useful experiment to do with well-being is how we use our discretionary income. Are we happier when we buy material things or when we pay for experiences? And one of the things we know now from good experimental research is the best things in life aren't things, they are experiences. So when we pay for vacations or trips to museums or tickets to a Red Sox game, we're happier than when we buy a new flat screen TV like the one behind me here. And that's because material things lend themselves to comparison, but experiences either strengthen existing relationships with the people we go with, or they bring us into contact with new people, or both. So that said, I'm quoting the title of Robert Putnam's famous book, Bowling Alone. Robert Putnam is the sociologist who studied a decline in how much we socialize with other people. And this decline has been steadily happening from the 1950s when television was introduced into our homes, all the way into the 2000s during the digital revolution. And what Robert Putnam found was that in the 2000s, joining clubs and civic organizations decreased by more than half. Family dinners and family vacations were down by a third. When Putnam first surveyed Americans in 1983, 12% said there's no one they could talk to about personal matters. In 2003, 25%, 1 in 4 Americans said there was no one they could talk to about personal matters. So this trend toward loneliness is dramatic. And what we think is happening is that it is all accelerated by the digital revolution. That as we see, we're all on our phones, on our screens so much of the time that we neglect each other and we neglect the world around us. This is an iconic photo that many of you may have seen of this guy completely oblivious to what was happening right next to him. So how do we lean into relationships? Well, here I'm going to harken back to one of my Zen teachers who said, attention is the most basic form of love. You know, and if you think about it, our undivided attention is the most valuable thing we have to give each other. It is also the most difficult thing these days to give each other because screens are so programmed to take us away from each other. So the question is, how do we structure our lives intentionally to do more of these in-person connecting things that keep our relationships with each other strong? There are many, many solutions being offered, including social programs and how neighborhoods are structured. But all of it is in the service of dealing with this pandemic of loneliness that has been upon us now for many decades and continues to get worse. This happens at work, and it's worth naming because the Gallup organization recently did a survey of 15 million workers, and they asked, do you have a best friend at work? People who had a best friend at work were better at their jobs. They had greater levels of happiness on the job. They were less likely to get injured on the job. but only 30% of workers said that they had a best friend at work. And those who didn't, only 1 in 12 people who didn't have a friend at work said that they were engaged in their jobs. This happens at the top. Half of CEOs who were surveyed of companies all over the world said that they felt lonely much of the time. So the take-home messages of this talk are pretty simple, but I think pretty important. That human connection is a major source, not just of happiness, but of our physical health and longevity. And that yes, technology has the power to connect us. It's connecting us right now as we are here together, but it also has great potential to isolate. And that the path of least resistance seems to be driving us toward increasing social isolation. And so we need to be more intentional in structuring our lives, both at home and at work, to counter this trend toward isolation. So with that, I will finish my talk, and I'd love to hear your thoughts about all this, any questions you have. And I'll stop sharing my screen. I guess, should I stop sharing my screen, Vish? Is that a...
Sure, that's fine.
Yeah, okay. Good, okay.
So Bob, wonderful. Thank you so much. That was a great talk. That was very provocative. As you can imagine, there are a lot of questions in the Q&A. To the audience, I just want to say again, remind you, if you want to ask questions, please put them in the Q&A. Jamie M. Chuno, our assistant director, is collecting the questions and feeding them to me. And I will be able to ask them. So we have very little time. I have a lot of questions from myself, but I will, I know I have access to you anytime, so I will ask the questions on behalf of the audience. Here is a very interesting question. So it's totally up to you if you want to answer it or not. It's very personal, but one of the questions is, how has the study impacted your life? Have you made any changes to your personal life decisions, habits based on what you have learned? I thought it's a really interesting question in many ways. If you were to write a memo to young Dr. Waldinger, what would you have said? So it's a great question, I thought.
It's a great question. Well, let me start with our study, and then I'll tell you about me personally. Yeah. So when our participants, the first generation, got to be in their 80s, we asked them to look back on their lives, and we said, what do you most regret about your life? And what are you proudest of? And almost to a person, the men said, I wish I hadn't spent so much time at work, and I wish I had spent more time with the people I cared about. And many of the women said, I wish I hadn't spent so much time worrying about what other people think. And then when we asked them what they were proudest of, almost to a person, they said something about their relationships. They didn't say, I became rich, or I became famous, or I achieved a lot, I won a lot of awards. Nobody said that. And some of them did all those things. They said, I was a good mentor. I was a good spouse. I was a good boss. I was a good friend, right? It was about their relationships. So that's the most important regrets and what people are proudest of. Now, as for me personally, I realized that I needed to listen to my own research. I could work 24/7. I mean, you don't get to be a Harvard professor without doing a lot of work, right? And I found that I could just sit all weekend with my laptop and just, review one more paper, do, one more chore. And I've started being very intentional about reaching out to my friends, about, sending little texts or emails saying, I'm just thinking of you. Do you want to take a walk this weekend? Do you want to go out for dinner on Thursday night? So I literally do much more of that than I ever did, in the past. When I was when I thought that achievement was the thing that was going to make me happiest. And it turns out it didn't. I mean, I think, I'm proud of some of the work I've done, to be sure. That's different from like winning awards, right? The awards don't make me happy. Doing satisfying work does, and my really keeping my connections vibrant with other people has been the greatest source of satisfaction.
So the question is, why is it that we are not able to do that? I just came from giving a talk at another university where I was advising early stage investigators, and the questions were always about, you can expect, okay, how do I get tenure? How do I get published? It's a next step.
Yeah.
And I don't blame them for it, given the cultural context. And I'm just curious what your advice would be.
Well, it can't be either or for most of us. I mean, there are things we need to do to take care of our careers, to make enough money to feed our families. I mean, all that is real, right? So, and the people you were speaking to, Vish, need to get tenure in order to have a secure job in academia. So, yeah. But that said, I think what we realize is that the people who sacrifice everything for work or fame or accolades, that those people end up feeling like they've given up too much in their lives. That's really the issue. And so it is really a matter of balance and a matter of saying, okay, I'm not going to have it all. I'm not going to be able to have it all. And one of the things I think makes it so tempting to focus on achievement and money and all that is that it's measurable. The problem is that relationships aren't measurable. They're changing all the time. My kids are happy with me sometimes and they think I'm annoying other times. It's not like they're, I can measure, I have badges of achievement as a parent. I really don't. And so I think that one of the difficulties for us is that we tend to prioritize what we can measure, and that's a false priority.
But that raises an interesting question, which has also been posed by a number of people, which I thought is very interesting. So the relationship is, so other things are measurable, the ones we talked about, material achievements. But in terms of relationships, is it the breadth of relationships? So the number of friends I have on Facebook as just an example, is it the number of friends I have, or is it the depth of connectivity? So because the discussion on loneliness especially the relationship side. What do you think?
Well, it's not the number of friends you have on social media. That's pretty clear. Right. That those are not real in a sense. But then the issue is what is sustaining for people. And what we learn from following all these lives is that one size clearly does not fit all, that we're all on a spectrum somewhere between introversion, shyness, and extroversion. And that for shy people, a lot of people in their lives is stressful and actually would break down their health. So for shy people, they may really need just a few relationships, as opposed to extroverts who get a lot of energy from other people, and they may want more people in their lives. And so it's a highly individual matter to determine for yourself, what is the right amount of connection, and do you want more or less than you have, and how can you work on that? There's no set answer.
So yeah, that was one of the questions that came up in the Q&A with extroverts versus introverts. So for some who are introverts, they don't necessarily feel lonely. They're very contented with the life they have.
Right, and we tend to glorify extroversion in our culture, and that's like silly. There's no reason to glorify extroverts, party animals. There are other cultures where a more contemplative stance toward life is respected and glorified. It's all within the realm of normal human life.
So then how are you defining loneliness? What does loneliness mean?
Yeah, loneliness isn't the same as social isolation. So social isolation means you're in a place where there aren't many people around.
Mhm.
And you could be socially isolated by choice or by, circumstance. Like,
Mhm.
many of us were socially isolated because of the COVID lockdown.
Mhm.
Loneliness is different. Loneliness is a subjective experience of being less connected to other people than you want to be. And that means you could be lonely in a crowd. You can be lonely in a marriage for sure. You could be perfectly content and not lonely in a hermitage on a mountaintop all by yourself, right? So loneliness is in the eye of the beholder.
Mhm. Mhm. Wonderful. Yes, yes. I'm glad you raised that. Some have asked about the role of religion in this, religion, faith, and what role do they play? I mean, some are religious, some are not. But what role does religion play in health and happiness?
Um, there are a lot of studies about this, and so I would not take our study as the final word at all.
Mhm.
When we looked at our participants,
Mhm.
there were people who had no religious or spiritual life, and there were people who had active spiritual lives.
Mhm.
One group wasn't happier than the other.
Mhm.
Many people who had religious or spiritual practices found it a great comfort during difficult times. But as groups, as comparative groups, they didn't differ in their
Mhm.
levels of well-being.
Mhm. Um, so when we discuss the happiness, generally, though you didn't say that today, so it's not you, but in general, we associate happiness as at an individual level, that one person can be happy or may be happy or unhappy, and her or his actions and state of mind and mental models could be helpful in being happy or not happy. But as you pointed out, there are outside forces, the context, the culture, the society matters in either promoting happiness and well-being of the members of the community. So two questions have come up. One is on, so you mentioned the datum on workforce and happiness of workers. For example, if you have a good friend at work, there are a number of outcomes that it is associated with. So that leads to the question of individual versus the group, especially. So one question is, what is the role of leadership in workforce? It's just not the individual worker. What is the duty of leaderships of work sites, for example, in promoting happiness among their workers and taking care of them?
Yeah,
Mhm.
it's really clear
Mhm.
from a variety of experiments
Mhm.
to increase well-being at work that
Mhm.
that it has to come from the top.
Mhm.
That efforts by, for example, a human resources department aren't sufficient to change a culture. That the culture of more connection, of knowing each other personally, has to be fostered by leadership, by the CEO on down. And really, they have to walk the walk and structure meetings. So I'll give you an example. Vivek Murthy, our Surgeon General, at his staff meeting, he instituted a practice where every week, for the first 5 minutes, one person in the staff meeting would talk about something about their personal life that they wanted everybody to know. And it turned out that this was the favorite part of the meeting, of any meeting all week, right? In that office.
Mhm.
And that these kinds of structurings are really important, but they have to come from leadership.
Mhm.
And then they can be adopted on down.
Mhm.
But
Mhm.
it's much more difficult to do from the ground up, or even from a human resources department, without leaders being more personal themselves, allowing themselves to be a little more
Mhm.
vulnerable and show more of themselves
Mhm.
in the workplace.
Mhm. And the very definition then of what does productivity mean, what does absenteeism and presenteeism mean, have to be revisited, given that we seldom take the time. People often take pride in saying, I'm booked from morning 9 to whatever, and I can speak for myself, zillion meetings, so.
Right. And we make busyness a kind of badge of honor.
Mm-hmm.
As opposed to having time to just connect with each other. That's why, it used to be that the water cooler or the coffee machine at the office was so important, because people would just see each other and chat. And we know that these casual chats, first of all, make us feel better, and also that they will often lead to deeper relationships where people come to know each other better.
Great. So one question that came up is there a predisposition to happiness? So
it is.
Because the question is, have you studied people who have a similar set of circumstances, quality of relationship, etc., and seen differences that are related to individual predisposition? So.
Oh, there is. Many of you know the book Winnie the Pooh, and there's Eeyore, who's always kind of sad and gloomy, and then there's Tigger, who's very bouncy. And we know people like this, right? And we're all on some kind of temperamental spectrum in that way. And they've done research on what they call the hedonic treadmill. And what it basically is saying is we all have a kind of baseline level of mood. And some of us have lower mood as our baseline, and some of us have higher mood. And when they actually study this, good estimates are that about 40% or 50% of our happiness is based on these genetically based temperamental factors. And about 10% is current life circumstance, and about 40% is movable, is under our control. But these temperamental factors really do matter.
So it's very important, I guess, not to be too deterministic, though. I mean, there is still 40 to 50% room to cultivate and create and design a world where people can be happy and promote well-being. So.
Absolutely. And that's a lot. That's a big proportion of our happiness.
Interesting. There is one technical question, which is, I thought I should ask you. It's interesting. And this question is, how do you know it, especially given your study of the long term, how do you know it's not reverse causality? So maybe people are healthy and happy, seek out more relationships. On the other hand, people are isolated, may not, so.
Yeah, it's a really important question. And clearly, many of these relationships are bidirectional. That in fact, we know that if you lose your health, you don't have the energy to stay connected with people in the same way. So it clearly works in the other direction as well. So none of this, particularly when we're talking about human life, none of it, one way is almost never the case. It's almost always multifactorial and influenced by multiple variables. That said, longitudinal research, the kind of research we do can never prove causation. But what we can do, because we look at what precedes what, is that we can go some distance to answering the kind of chicken and egg questions. And it doesn't mean we can prove causation, because for that you would need well-controlled experiments, which you can't do on human beings by and large, not on their psychological well-being.
Right.
But what we do know is that this is a central question, and so we do our best to try to account for different directions of influence.
We are running out of time, and the questions are still flying in. I have just two questions, maybe for quick answers, I think. One of them is definitely not easy to answer quickly, so I will ask it last. But maybe, but what do you think of the terms individualistic versus collectivist cultures, and whether that individualism versus collectivism contributes to happiness or not? So.
Well, what we do know is that people who develop along lines where they are concerned with other people's well-being and where they are concerned with causes beyond the self, those people tend to feel that life is more meaningful. And in that sense, they are happier. They feel that life is better for them. So in that sense, collectivist societies, now granted, collectivist societies can be very confining as well. That sense of, you know, I wish I hadn't worried about what other people thought so much. That's more likely to be the case in a collectivist society than in an individual society. But nevertheless, what we find is that concern for other people's well-being turns out to be a pillar, a bedrock of our own well-being. Actually, the Dalai Lama has a great quote. He said, "The wise, selfish person takes care of other people, because what goes around comes around."
Interesting. Wonderful. That you know, that's a great way. I'm tempted to end it, but there is one wonderful question that I thought I'll let you respond to. This comment / editorial comment / question says, "It seems to me that we are discovering things that women have always understood about the importance of relationships and paying attention to our relationships, loving our people." What are your thoughts on this? I have to let you end with that, you know. So.
I think that's right. I mean, you know, there are people who responded to my TED Talk saying, "Well, duh," and often they were women. And I think, you know, I think women have been socialized to know about the importance of relationships more than men. Men are much more kind of instrumentally focused, more transactionally focused, often, stereotypically at least. And that women have, for a long time, been raised to prioritize connection with other people. So, you know, and the thing I'm very clear about is that I am not revealing something to the world that's a shocker, right? It's not rocket science, what we're talking about. It's just that now we have good scientific data to back up what our grandmothers always knew and were telling us all along.
Wonderful. Bob, thank you so much. I wish there are so many questions and comments. We can spend the next 2 hours asking these questions. I'm sure that is your experience too, but I'm so grateful to you as a friend of the center, as our faculty colleague, for all the work you are doing, and in not only generating the science and knowledge, but also in translating that science for public benefit. Thank you for joining us.
This has been a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. I also want to thank the audience for joining us. We have a record crowd here today, more than 700 people who joined us. I hope you have an opportunity to read the book. This is just a great, an important topic, especially at a time like this in our world. I also want to thank our team who organized this series of webinars. As you know, the Lee Kumshon Center organizes these seminars and webinars monthly. Our next one is on April 5th in our continuing series on social media and happiness. We have been doing it all year long, and the next one is April 5th. Please come to our website. You'll be able to get more information on how to log on or how to come in person, because we also have these in person now. So thank you, everyone. Thanks again for joining us. And thank you, Bob.
Yes, a pleasure.